and my wife's birthday. She introduced me like this. This is my husband, no degree, no future, living off my family's company. Everyone laughed. They didn't know I had saved that company. I didn't blink. I just smiled, raised my glass, and said, "A toast, this is the last time." Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. There's one thing nobody prepares you for in life. It's not the humiliation itself. It's the 2-second silence that comes before people laugh. Those 2 seconds I know by heart. I know exactly how long it took between my wife's voice finishing the sentence and the first laugh breaking out in the hall. 2 seconds I counted, because I was prepared, and even so that silence weighed differently from anything I'd ever felt. It was Saturday night. A rented buffet in Villa Mariana. One of those that has mirrors on the wall to look bigger than it is. Napkins folded in the shape of a lotus flower and waiters in black vests serving national sparkling wine in thin glass flutes. There were about 40 people scattered around the hall. Her family, her friends, her dad's partners, people I'd greeted by name for years and who barely knew where I worked. I was leaning near the cold cuts table, glass in hand, observing. I've done that since I was a kid observing. My dad used to say that whoever knows how to look before speaking doesn't make many mistakes in life. That night, I was looking at everything with a calmness that not even I expected for myself. That's when she called me from the other side of the hall. "Babe, come here. I want to introduce you to Rodrigo." Rodrigo was the new investor my father-in-law had brought to talk about company expansion. A man of about 50 in a graphite gray suit, polished shoes that reflected the chandelier's light. The kind that shakes your hand firmly and is already evaluating you before letting go. I saw that immediately. I always do. I crossed the hall, got to her side. She smiled, and that's when she spoke. With a smile on her face, the smile of someone who thinks she's being funny in a circle of friends. She turned to Rodrigo and said with a slightly loud voice, the way people speak when they want someone else to hear, "This is my husband, no degree, no future, just lives off my family's company." Rodrigo gave a short laugh, a situational one, not knowing well what to do with what he'd just heard. My mother-in-law, who was 2 meters behind, covered her mouth with her hand, pretending it was too much. My brother-in-law let out a more open laugh, the kind of laugh a person saves for a while and takes advantage of any loophole. And it kept spreading. It wasn't 40 people who laughed, but the ones who laughed were the ones that mattered to her. And it was enough. I didn't blink. I looked at her, then at Rodrigo, then at the glass I was holding, and I smiled. Not because it was funny, not because I agreed with a single comma of what she said, but because at that exact moment, I knew what was going to happen before that night ended. And smiling was the most honest thing I could do. There's a huge difference between the person who smiles because they don't have an answer and the person who smiles because they have the right answer and the right time hasn't come yet. In that hall, I was the second type and nobody there knew it. Let me tell you who I am before continuing. I was born in Qley. Whoever knows the city has already understood everything without me needing to explain anything else. Whoever doesn't know it will understand now. Qley is in the Pernambuco outback, and it's a city that all of Brazil uses and never gives credit to. Half the clothes circulating in this country came from there. At some point, it passed through the hands of some seamstress in some neighborhood of Qley, was folded, packed, and dispatched at dawn, without anyone's name on the tag. The Solanka Fair happens every week and moves more money than many companies headquartered in glass buildings in downtown Sao Paulo. But the world doesn't talk about Qley. The world uses Qley without knowing its name. My dad had a stall at the fair since before I was born. I started helping at 8 years old, not because the family needed it, but because I wanted to, because the fair teaches what the school doesn't teach in any classroom. I learned to calculate profit margins before learning fractions. I learned to read the customer by the way they look at the merchandise before learning to read a map. I learned that stagnant product is a certain loss, that whoever buys with emotion doesn't haggle over the price, and that silence in negotiation is more powerful than any argument. These things enter a person and stay. There's no degree that replaces it, and there's no laugh in a Villa Mariana buffet hall that erases it. When I came to Sao Paulo, I was 22, had a canvas backpack, money saved for 2 months of boarding, and no contacts in the city. I settled in a room in Perry, 2 blocks from Bras, shared bathroom, a window facing a hallway. In 3 weeks, I was already working. Stock assistant. It wasn't where I wanted to end up. It was where I needed to start to understand what I needed to understand. And the place I ended up wasn't just any clothing factory. It was Moda Cavalcante, the family company that years later, on a Saturday night, laughed at me in a hall with napkins folded into lotus flowers. But there's one thing none of them knew that night. Not Rodrigo in the gray suit. Not my brother-in-law with his saved laugh. Not my mother-in-law with her hand over her mouth. And especially not her, who raised her voice to introduce me as dead weight in front of 40 people. None of them knew what Moda Cavalcante was 3 years ago. None of them knew what it had become, and none of them knew yet why it had happened. In the right pocket of my suit jacket, that night, there was a document. I knew what was written on it, I knew what it meant, and I knew that before the buffet closed its doors, that document was going to change what everyone there thought they knew about me. When I raised a glass, it wasn't an impulse, it wasn't an outburst. It was the end of a plan that took 2 years to get ready, built in silence in the late nights, while everyone slept, thinking I was useless. And that toast I made that night, those words I said with a glass in the air and 40 pairs of eyes staring at me, didn't come from anger, they came from certainty. But for you to understand what I said, you need to understand what I found when I arrived at that company. You need to understand what I saw that nobody else wanted to see. And you need to understand why a man who learned to count money weighing merchandise at the Salanka Fair in Qley was the only person in that room who knew with precision what Moda Cavalcante was really worth. It starts now. The first smell of Sao Paulo I really felt wasn't upon arrival. It was the next morning. On arrival, what you get is noise, honking, braking, radio voices leaking from bus windows, the street vendor shouting deals at the terminal. You're so focused on trying not to get lost that the smell doesn't register. But the next morning, when you wake up in a 6-square-meter boarding room with a window to the hall and open the door to go to the bathroom, Sao Paulo hits you all at once. It's a smell of a city that hasn't stopped, that hasn't really slept, that's already working before you open your eyes. On that first morning, sitting on the edge of the bed with my feet on the cold ceramic floor, I did quick math in my head. I had money for 58 days to fit into a city of 12 million people that didn't know I existed. I wasn't scared. I made a list. My dad taught me that. When the problem seems too big, you take it apart into smaller pieces until the first possible step appears. Then you take that step, just that one. The rest you solve later. The first step was bras. Anyone who understands the clothing trade in Brazil knows that bras is where it all begins. The streets, the wholesalers, the warehouses stacked to the ceiling, the smell of synthetic fabric mixed with delivery truck diesel. I grew up hearing about bras as if it were a promised land of apparel. At the Salanka in Qley, when a supplier was doing poorly, the elders would say he needed a trip to Bras to update himself. It was the standard, it was the reference. When I arrived at Orient Street on a Tuesday morning, I understood why, but I also saw right away that first time something that those inside no longer see. Because those inside a place become part of the landscape and stop questioning. I was an outsider, newly arrived, with the eye of someone who learned to read the market before learning to read a book. And what I saw was a still incredibly powerful commerce, but operating at a pace that the world had started to leave behind. The stores opened early, the shopkeepers arrived by chartered buses from the countryside, bought wholesale, filled their bags, and returned. It was the way it had always been. And while that way worked, it worked really well. But I noticed right in that first week walking around the neighborhood that the sidewalks had fewer people than the stories I'd heard described, that some warehouses had shelves with too much empty space, that the movement was good, but there was an underlying tiredness. I went to work at the third warehouse where I knocked on the door asking for a job, stock assistant, minimum wage, fixed hours, no formal contract at first, because the owner wanted to see how I did before signing anything. I accepted without haggling. It wasn't pride, it was strategy. Whoever needs to prove what they're worth doesn't argue about the entry door. The warehouse was on Florencio de Abreu Street, at the end of a corridor that you'd pass on the street and not even notice existed. Cardboard boxes stacked up to 2 meters high, a roll of price tags in my pocket all day, inventory done by hand in a hardcover notebook. It had worked like that for 20 years, and nobody saw a reason to change. I stayed 3 months. I learned what I needed to learn and left without drama. I ended up at Moda Cavalcante through a recommendation from my boarding house roommate, a guy from Maranhão named Erivaldo, who worked in a neighboring factory and knew they needed someone to reinforce the stock. He gave me the address on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, I was at the door. Moda Cavalcante occupied the second and third floors of an old townhouse in BOM Retiro on Jose Paulino Street, which is the backbone of the fashion trade in that neighborhood. The name was painted on the facade in blue letters with gold borders, that 90s style that the family had never bothered to update. Inside, it was a mix of office, showroom, and warehouse, clothes hanging on iron racks, fabric folded on plywood shelves, a meeting table that also served as a lunch table, depending on the day. The man who welcomed me was Mr. Cavalcante. I won't say he was kind, he was direct, which is sometimes better than kind. He looked me up and down, asked where I was from. I said Karuru, and he made a head gesture that could mean anything. He asked if I had experience. I mentioned the 3 months at the previous warehouse and the years at Solanka. He frowned as if Northeastern fairs were something different from real commerce. I pretended not to see it. I was hired. The job was receiving merchandise, checking invoices, organizing stock by collection and size, picking wholesale orders, and helping with loading when a truck arrived. Physical work, requiring attention, patience. I did it carefully because it's what I know how to do. And when you do things carefully in a place where nobody is used to seeing care, people notice. That's how she noticed me. She walked into the warehouse on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying a clipboard and a face of someone who just had an argument with someone. Hair tied up, a blouse from her own brand, white sneakers. She came straight to check a shipment that had arrived wrong, which I'd already separated the problematic boxes and stuck a note on each one, explaining the divergence before she even needed to ask. She stood still, looking at it for about 3 seconds. Then she looked at me. Was it you? It was. How did you know which ones were wrong? The invoice said 42 pieces in size S. 38 came. I counted. She spent another second looking at me without saying anything. Nobody counts before I get here and ask them to count. I didn't know what to answer to that, so I didn't answer anything. She turned around, wrote something down on the clipboard, and left. She didn't smile, didn't say thanks, but she came back the next day with a question about another order, and the next day with another. And it went on like that for weeks, her arriving with a question and me having the info before she finished formulating the question. I don't know exactly when it turned into something else. These things don't have a date, but one day she arrived at the warehouse without a clipboard and without a question. She leaned against a shelf and said she was going to get a coffee and wanted to know if I wanted one too. I said yes. We both went down to the corner bar. We ordered coffee with milk and a coccinia because it was late afternoon and there were no more hot pastries, and we stayed there talking for 40 minutes, as if we had plenty of time, which neither of us had. She was smart. That's the kind of thing you notice quickly in some people. She had her own ideas, knew how to articulate them, saw problems clearly. What she didn't have was space within her own family's company to put any of that into practice. Her dad would listen, nod his head, and do it his way. It had always been like that. I really listened to her, and I think that made a difference. We started seeing each other outside of work. She hadn't told her dad at first, and I understood the reason without her needing to explain. It wasn't about me specifically, it was about what I represented in Mr. Cavalcante's head, a stock employee, Northeasterner, with no formal education. I wasn't the profile he imagined for a son-in-law, but she kept going. And one night, after a simple dinner at a pub in Belém with cold beer and cod fritters, she held my hand across the table and said she didn't want to hide from anyone anymore. It wasn't the most dramatic moment of my life, but it was one of the most honest. What I didn't know that night, with her hand in mine and the beer getting warm in the glass, was that truly entering that family's life would show me something that would change everything, something none of them could see because they were too close. And that I, coming from where I came from, with the eye I'd trained since I was 8 at the Solanka in Qley, would see in the first week. Moda Cavalcante was going broke, and nobody inside wanted to believe it. There's a type of problem that only appears to those who know where to look. It's not the kind of problem that comes with a warning, with a red chart on the wall, with an employee entering the boss's office asking for an urgent meeting. It's the kind that settles in slowly, beneath the surface, while everyone continues their normal day. Exchanging orders, serving customers, having lunch together at the meeting table, as if nothing were different. Whoever grew up in a fair learns to feel this kind of problem before being able to name it. It's a physical sensation. First, something doesn't add up. Something is too heavy in the wrong place. I felt it in my first week as the family's son-in-law. Before, as a stock employee, I saw the warehouse's movement, I saw invoices, I saw order volume, but it was an inside-out view, limited to what passed through my hands. When I fully entered their lives, I started to see the company from another angle. Family dinners where Mr. Cavalcante talked about business like someone reciting a memorized prayer. Weekend conversations where the numbers were always approximate, always rounded up, always accompanied by some explanation that deflected before getting to the detail. I started paying real attention. On a Sunday lunch at their house, while my mother-in-law served rice and my brother-in-law talked about a car he wanted to buy, I picked up an electricity bill that was on the kitchen counter. It was none of my business, but my eye went straight to the amount. It was the third consecutive month I saw the company bill for that amount on that counter, which meant it was being paid late, that the automatic debit had failed, that the cash flow wasn't comfortably covering the fixed expenses. It's this kind of detail that most people gloss over because it seems small. To me, it's not small. To me, it's the tip of what's underneath. I asked her to show me the company's reports. She looked at me with a strange expression, a mix of surprise and something I couldn't decipher at the time. Then she said she'd see if she could get access. It took 2 weeks. In that time, I'd already built a reasonable hypothesis in my head of what I was going to find. I found worse. Moda Cavalcante had a classic problem that nobody wanted to call by its name. The entire business model depended on a flow of customers that had been disappearing for a long time. The shopkeepers who came in person to buy wholesale, filled large bags, carried them on their arms, and returned to the countryside of Sao Paulo, to Minas, to Parana. That flow had dropped more than 40% in the last 3 years. Not all at once. Slowly, one less customer here, a smaller order there, a reseller who stopped showing up without giving an explanation. Mr. Cavalcante attributed it to the economic scenario, the dollar, inflation, the pandemic, the government, anything that was out of his control. But it wasn't that, or rather, it wasn't just that. The world had changed the way it bought, and Moda Cavalcante kept selling the way it sold when Mr. Cavalcante's father founded the company. While the shopkeepers stopped taking charter buses to BOM Retiro, they were discovering suppliers at the mall. They were finding clothing factories on Mercado Libre that delivered to their homes within 3 days. They were joining wholesale WhatsApp groups and buying without leaving their cities. The world had created a virtual bras, and Moda Cavalcante wasn't there. Putting together a complete spreadsheet took 3 weeks. I did it in the late nights, after she went to sleep, on the kitchen table of the apartment we'd rented in Tatuape. Month-by-month revenue of the last 4 years. Fixed costs, variable costs, inventory turnover by product line, average ticket by sales channel, margin per piece. When I finished, I printed it on 12 pages and put it inside a simple folder, one of those plastic ones with an elastic band, that cost 2 reis at the stationery store. I scheduled a talk with Mr. Cavalcante on a Tuesday afternoon when business was slower. He received me in his office, which was at the back of the second floor, with a window facing a brick corridor, a dark wooden desk, a family picture frame, an ashtray that was no longer used but was still there. He offered me water. I sat on the opposite side of the desk and opened the folder. I presented everything calmly, without rushing, without jargon, the way my dad presented bills to buyers at the fair, straight and without embellishment. I showed the drop in revenue. I showed the fixed cost that wouldn't yield while the revenue fell. I showed the accumulated inventory that represented stagnant money, and I showed on the last page what I believed could change that. E-commerce, presence on marketplaces, a direct sales channel via WhatsApp with a digital catalog, integrated logistics that allowed selling to a buyer in Belém without her needing to leave her house. I explained that I'd done this rudimentarily, with a few tests I hadn't told anyone about yet, that the first results were promising, that with structure and attention, it was possible to rebuild the company's sales channel so that it no longer depended on the dwindling in-person flow. Mr. Cavalcante heard everything. He listened from start to finish, without interrupting me, which made me think for a moment that I'd been more convincing than I expected. Then he closed the folder, pushed it gently in my direction, and said, "I'm glad you have free time to play with Excel." There was a silence. Not the 2-second silence from the party, a different silence. The kind of person leaves after a sentence they think is definitive to see if you lower your head. I didn't lower mine. I took the folder, thanked him for his time, and left the room. In the hallway, standing outside the closed door, I spent about 10 seconds breathing, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because at that moment I understood, with an exactness that only comes when the illusion ends for good, that I was never going to convince that man with an argument. Not because the numbers were wrong. The numbers were right, and he knew it. But because accepting my numbers meant accepting that the problem existed. And accepting that the problem existed meant accepting that his way of running the company wasn't working anymore. And that was too big for him to swallow on that Tuesday afternoon. So I made a decision right there in the hallway with the plastic folder in my hand. I wasn't going to convince him. I was going to do it alone, without asking for authorization, without announcing it to anyone, using what I knew, what I'd learned since I was 8 weighing merchandise at the Solanka, what I'd absorbed in every warehouse I worked at, in every invoice I checked, in every customer I observed, the way my dad taught me to observe and to build Moda Cavalcante's digital sales channel right under everyone's nose. And when the numbers spoke for themselves, I wouldn't need anyone to agree, because numbers don't ask for permission. What I didn't imagine yet was the price that path would demand, not in money, but in something else that is much harder to replace when it's gone. But that comes later. For now, what matters is what I did during those late nights in Tatuape, with a laptop on the kitchen table and the city of Sao Paulo running outside, while everyone slept, thinking I was useless. If you're here until now, you already know this story isn't simple. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's ahead. Like the video, comment on what you're thinking, and share it with someone who was once underestimated by those who shouldn't have done it. Because the part that changes everything is still to come. The first thing I learned at the Solanka in Peru is that the market doesn't wait for you to be ready. My dad would wake up at 4 in the morning on Fridays. He didn't have an alarm clock. He didn't need one. His body had calibrated itself over the years, because a fair doesn't wait for those who arrive late. You set up your stall early, or you lose the best spot. You restock quickly, or the customer moves on without looking back. There's no second chance on the same day. The next day you try again, but that specific customer at that specific moment is gone. I carried that with me. I always have. So when I decided I was going to build Moda Cavalcante's digital channel without asking anyone's permission, I didn't spend weeks planning. I opened the laptop that same night. It was almost midnight. She had gone to sleep early. She had an early meeting the next day. The apartment was quiet, just the sound of the fan in the bedroom and the muted sound of Sao Paulo down below, which never truly goes silent. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and started. I hadn't taken an e-commerce course. I hadn't taken a digital marketing course. What I had was this. I knew how to buy. I knew how to sell, I knew how to calculate margins, and I knew that a customer buys when they feel trust in the product and ease in the process. That's universal. That doesn't change with any platform. The rest I learned by researching. I spent the first 2 weeks just studying. YouTube tutorials, blog articles, seller forums, WhatsApp groups of people who already sold on marketplaces. I wrote everything down in a notebook I kept inside my backpack, out of everyone's sight. Not because I was doing something wrong, but because I knew that if I mentioned it before getting results, I'd hear the same thing I heard in Mr. Cavalcante's office, that I didn't have the patience for it. In the 3rd week I started operating, I created a seller account on Mercado Libre with the company's corporate tax ID, which I had access to because I handled part of the stock's finances. I photographed the first pieces early on a Saturday morning. Before any employee arrived, I used the white background of a warehouse wall, a floor lamp I borrowed from the office, and my phone in portrait mode. It wasn't professional catalog photography. It was clean, well lit, and honest to the product. Sometimes that's enough. I registered the first 30 pieces. I wrote each description myself, thinking of the countryside shopkeeper who'd read that without seeing the piece in person. I put exact measurements, fabric composition, info on how the product behaves after washing, details that seem obvious but that most ads don't have. I set prices with a fair margin, neither below the market to seem suspicious, nor above to push away those who didn't know me yet, and I waited. The first order took 4 days. A women's size and blouse. A customer from Ribeirão Preto. A small amount, but I kept looking at the phone notification for a time that didn't match the size of the sale, because it wasn't about the amount, it was proof that it worked. It was Ribeirão Preto buying from Bom Retiro, without hitting the road, without paying for a van freight, without spending the day out. It was exactly what I'd said in the plastic folder that Mr. Cavalcante pushed back to me. In 2 weeks, 11 orders had arrived. In a month, 43. I opened a WhatsApp business channel with a digital catalog of the main pieces. I started advertising in shopkeeper groups that I joined little by little, presenting Moda Cavalcante as a supplier that delivered all over Brazil with a guaranteed deadline. I replied to messages at 10 at night, at 6 in the morning, during my lunch break. I didn't have a schedule because I didn't have a partner, I didn't have a team, I didn't have anyone, it was just me and the phone. In the 3rd month, the digital revenue had surpassed the in-person wholesale of an entire week. I stopped one afternoon, looked at the number on the screen, and stayed quiet for a while. It wasn't euphoria, it was a feeling heavier and truer than euphoria. It was the confirmation of something I already knew since I'd sat at that meeting table with the plastic folder in my hand, that the problem had a solution, that this was the solution and that I'd arrived at it alone, without a framed degree, without a gray-suited investor partner, without anyone's blessing. It was at this point that I decided to show Mr. Cavalcante again. This time I didn't bring a folder, I brought my phone. I opened the marketplace sales dashboard in front of him. I showed the number of orders, the month's revenue, the customer reviews, which were already at almost 5 stars with over 80 reviews. I showed the WhatsApp channel with the queue of messages from shopkeepers in states that Moda Cavalcante had never served. Pará, Amazonas, Maranhão, Rio Grande do Norte. People who bought clothes from Bom Retiro without ever having seen Bom Retiro. He kept looking at the screen for a good while, then looked at me and said, "All right, keep going." It wasn't a thank you, it wasn't a congratulations, it wasn't recognition, it was all right, keep going. The way you tell an employee who properly did a task that was expected of him. But I took that all right and turned it into fuel because it was what I needed to operate without interference. In the following months, I structured everything. I organized the shipping logistics, opened accounts with 2 carriers with volume contracts. I set up a posting routine that worked with 2 stock employees I trained during the slowest hours. I created the brand's presence on Shopee because the customer profile was different and complementary. I set up an exchange and return process that reduced complaints before they became a reputation problem on the platform. The e-commerce grew another 30% in the following quarter. During this period, I slept an average of 5 hours a night. I'm not complaining about it. It was a choice. But she started to notice that I came to bed late, that I woke up before the alarm, that the laptop was always on the kitchen table with some tab open. And for a while she asked what I was doing, and I'd tell her. She listened carefully, asked good questions, sometimes gave suggestions that I used. There's a version of that story that could have been beautiful. The 2 of us building together in silence while the family slept. But then came the dinners. As the company improved, social events increased. Suppliers inviting us to dinner. Partners bringing new people to meet. Mr. Cavalcante accepting invitations from commercial associations he previously ignored. And in those environments, I went along because I was her husband. But in those environments, I was introduced in ways that changed over time. At first, it was my husband who handles the digital side, neutral, descriptive. Then it became my husband, who helps me with some things at the company, lesser. Then there was no more explanation. It was just my husband, said with the kind of smile that ends the subject before anyone asks more. I saw this happen and didn't say anything. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt in a specific way, the kind you feel later when you're alone and the silence gives you back what you pretended not to notice during the day. But I learned something else from my dad besides waking up early. I'd learned that a good fair vendor doesn't shout the value of the merchandise when someone walks past the stall with disdain. He waits because whoever knows what they have doesn't need to convince those who don't want to see. The time to speak would come. I just didn't know yet that it would arrive in a rented hall in Villa Mariana, with sparkling wine in hand and 40 people around. But it was coming. There is a specific moment when you realize you're being erased. It's not a dramatic moment. There's no argument. There's no slamming door. There's no phrase said with a clear intention to hurt. It's something much more silent than that. It's a meeting where someone tells a story you lived and your name doesn't appear at any point. It's an interview you read in a business blog where the company's transformation is described in detail and the only person mentioned is the one who signs the social contract. It's a dinner where someone asks how the company turned around, and the answer that comes from the other side of the table doesn't include you even as a detail. You blink, you wait, you think maybe it's distraction, a lapse, the rush of the person speaking. But when it happens 3 times in a row, you stop calling it a lapse. The first article came out on a fashion and business portal in Sao Paulo. A journalist had contacted Mr. Cavalcante after seeing Moda Cavalcante's growth numbers in the Mercado Livre sellers ranking, where the company had reached the Mercado Lider level. In less than a year, which was no small thing, it was public confirmation of a sales volume and reputation that very few sellers reach in that time frame. I discovered the article by chance on a Sunday morning, looking for something else on my phone. The title said something about digital transformation in the Sao Paulo textile trade. It had a photo of Mr. Cavalcante in front of the BOM Retiro townhouse facade, smiling with crossed arms the way someone who is satisfied with what they've built does. The text described the company's turnaround with details I recognized because I'd lived every single one of them. It talked about the marketplaces, the WhatsApp business, the integrated logistics, the expansion to customers in states that didn't previously reach BOM Retiro. My name didn't appear once. I went to the end of the text expecting a mention, a thank you, anything, a line saying the initiative had come from someone inside. Nothing. It was as if the transformation had happened on its own, by the company's own will, or worse, by the competence of those who never believed it was possible. I closed the phone, kept looking at the ceiling for a time I couldn't measure. She was still sleeping. I didn't wake her up. I locked what I felt in a deep place and went to make coffee. Weeks later, Mr. Cavalcante was invited to speak at a commercial association event in Bom Retiro. An afternoon, in a hall of a commercial building on Jose Paulino Street, about 60 people seated, local merchants listening to cases of companies that had survived the difficult period of traditional retail. He went as a success case. I went along because she went, and she went because it was the family's company. I sat in the middle of the audience. I heard Mr. Cavalcante speak for 20 minutes about business vision, about the courage to change, about not being afraid of digital when the market demands adaptation. The audience took notes, some filmed with their phones. It was a good presentation. He knew how to speak in public. He had the fluency of someone who spent his life negotiating at wholesale fairs. At a certain point, someone in the audience asked who had been responsible for the e-commerce implementation, the technical and operational side of the turnaround. Mr. Cavalcante took a short pause. He said it had been a collective family effort, that when the company decides to change, everyone jumps on board together. I was sitting 6 rows away, and he didn't look in my direction once. I clapped along with everyone when the presentation ended, because it was what the situation demanded and because I hadn't reached my limit yet. But something hardened that day. It wasn't anger, it was something else. It was the kind of clarity that only comes when the last doubt goes away. That night, on the subway ride back home, she was excited talking about the event, about how well her dad had done, about how much the company was being recognized. I listened, replied at the right moments, but I was processing something inside that didn't fit in that conversation. I started noticing during that period that she was also changing. Not all at once. People don't change all at once. They change in layers. And each layer is so thin that you question whether you're seeing it right or projecting. But when the layers accumulate, you stop questioning. She had started attending a group of young entrepreneurs that her dad's partner had introduced her to. Monthly dinners at a restaurant in a tame, networking agendas, exchanging contacts that environment of those building a professional reputation in a specific circle. She went every time. I was invited the first few times, and I went. But I was a strange element at those tables. I had no job title, I had no company with a name, I had no business card with a printed function. The first few times, she introduced me with a long explanation that felt like discomfort disguised as care. Then she started introducing me just by my name. Then she started going alone, saying it was boring for me, that I wouldn't enjoy it, that it was more specific networking for her sector. I let it be. I didn't fight, I didn't demand, I didn't make a scene, but I observed. One night, I got home earlier than expected because a meeting had been canceled. She was in the living room with her laptop open, chatting via message with someone. When I walked in, she closed the window quickly with a gesture that tried to look natural and failed. I didn't say anything. I went to the kitchen, drank water, went to take a shower. It wasn't the kind of thing I was going to confront without certainty, but I kept it in mind. 3 weeks later, on an afternoon when she had gone out for an appointment, her phone rang on the couch while I was in the living room. I had no intention of snooping. It was the name that appeared on the notification screen before I could manage not to see it. It was her cousin whom she talked to every week. The message appeared completely on the notification because the phone was unlocked. It was 6 lines. I read it by accident and then read it again because the brain sometimes needs to repeat to accept what the eyes have already processed. She was telling her cousin that I'd help a lot with the company, that she recognized that, but that it was hard to explain to people what I did because I had no title, no degree, and that sometimes she felt she was walking backwards while her circle was moving forwards. She used exactly that expression, walking backwards. I put the phone back on the couch, exactly where it was. I went to the kitchen table, opened my laptop, spent about 10 minutes looking at the screen without seeing anything, and then I opened a new tab and started doing something I've been postponing for months. I accessed the entrepreneur portal and started the process of transforming my micro-enterprise into a real company, LLC, its own name, its own structure separate from everything I'd built inside Multigenerational, a company that was mine. Mine alone, that didn't depend on the Bomb Retiro townhouse, nor on anyone's corporate tax ID. It wasn't a decision made in the heat of pain. It was a decision made with the cool head of someone who read the message, understood what it meant, and concluded that some things, when they show what they really are, you don't pretend you didn't see it. My dad had a simple saying that I heard so many times in life that it became part of my reasoning without me noticing. He said a good stall doesn't sustain a bad fare vendor, but a good fare vendor sustains any stall. What he meant by that is that the value is in the person, not in the structure where they are installed. I'd built something real inside a structure that didn't see me. It was time to build inside a structure that had my name on the door. That day, I also opened the spreadsheet I kept updated with Moda Cavalcante's digital performance. Revenue, percentage growth, number of active customers, reputation on the platforms, everything documented with dates, everything traceable, everything verifiable. I started organizing this data in a separate document, not as a threat, as a record, as the honest documentation of a job that had a name and had an owner, even if the world didn't know it yet. Outside the window, Sao Paulo did what Sao Paulo always does. It kept going without stopping, without asking if you were ready, without waiting for you to resolve what was weighing heavily inside. I closed the laptop when she got home. We had dinner together, talked about the day, watched a bit of series before sleeping. Everything normal on the outside. On the inside, something had closed with a clarity that wouldn't go back. I knew what was ahead. I just didn't know yet that the stage was going to be a buffet in Villa Mariana, with napkins folded into lotus flowers and national sparkling wine in thin glass flutes. But it was close. There are goodbyes that happen long before the last conversation. There's no set date. There's no definitive sentence. There's no moment you can point to later and say, it was here, it was on this day, it was at this hour that it ended. They happen in small pieces, scattered over weeks and months, so diluted in everyday life that you absorb each one without naming it. And one day you're sitting at the breakfast table, looking at the person on the other side, and you realize you've already said goodbye to them several times, without either of you having said a word about it. I went through this for almost a whole year. After the night I read the message on her phone, I didn't confront anything. Not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because I already knew what the conversation would confirm. And confirming before the time serves no purpose other than bringing the pain forward without bringing the solution forward. So I continued. I went to work, came home, had dinner, slept, woke up, continued building what I was building in silence, continued documenting everything, continued making Moda Cavalcante's digital company grow, while the distance inside the Tatuape apartment grew with it, each at its own pace, without speaking to each other. The apartment was the place where this became most visible. Early in the marriage, the kitchen was the center of everything. We had the habit of making dinner together, even when we got home late, even when the day had been bad. She chopped, I seasoned, we talked about anything while the frying pan heated up. It was a small ritual, but it was ours. In those moments, she was the same person who'd gone down to the corner bar to have coffee with milk and a coccinia on a late afternoon after work. The person who asked good questions, who really listened, who saw beyond what was on the surface. I started noticing when this ritual began to unravel. First, she started coming home later. Meetings, appointments, the entrepreneur group dinner, sector events. Fair, normal, the agenda grew along with the company's recognition. I understood and didn't complain, but the dinner together became everyone heats up whatever is in the fridge, and the kitchen stopped being the center and became just the place where the microwave was. Then the weekends started changing. Before, we protected Saturday mornings. We woke up without an alarm, made coffee slowly, sometimes even went to the neighborhood street market without rushing. A small thing, but it was the time the week didn't steal. That time began to be occupied, always with a real justification, always with a concrete reason, but it kept occupying until there was none left. And then began what I internally called the presentation period. At every social event we went to together that year, I observed how she introduced me, not in a paranoid way, not sniffing out offense where there was none, but paying genuine attention, because the words people choose to describe those they love say a lot about what they're feeling inside. There was a dinner with a couple of her friends at an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn. Small tables, low light, that environment that invites a long conversation. The friend's husband was a commercial manager for a distributor. The friend had an image consulting firm. Nice people, good conversation. At some point, she introduced me as my husband who understand a lot about technology. It wasn't wrong, but technology was a word that fit anything and said nothing specific. It was generic the way you're generic when you don't want to get into detail. At a collection launch cocktail for a Moda Cavalcante partner supplier, an event in a renovated warehouse in Villa Maddalena, with craft beer and a DJ, she introduced me to an acquaintance as my husband. Just that. The acquaintance waited a second, as if something else was coming. It didn't. At a Sunday lunch at the in-laws' house, when my brother-in-law brought his new girlfriend and Mr. Cavalcante went around introducing everyone at the table to her, he got to my turn and said, "And this is Mateus, Fernanda's husband," with no function, no context, as if I were her biographical data and not a person with my own history. I heard all of this and filed it away. What weighed on me wasn't wounded pride. It was the awareness that she agreed with those descriptions. Not just tolerated, agreed. Because if she disagreed, she would have corrected it even once. She would have added something. She would have said anything to signal that the erasure wasn't welcome. She never did. It was during one of these periods that I started working even more hours. Not as an escape, let me be honest about that. It was strategy. I knew the time I had inside Moda Cavalcante had an expiration date, and I needed my exit to be at the moment I chose, in the way I chose, with everything prepared on the outside before closing the door from the inside. I accelerated the growth of the digital channel, opened another profile on a marketplace, this one focused on men's fashion, which was a segment the company had, but had never prioritized in online sales. I set up seasonal campaigns for commemorative dates, Mother's Day, Valentine's Day, back to school, which in the textile sector moves more than people outside imagine. And in parallel, in the latest hours of the night, after she fell asleep, I built my company. It wasn't fast. These things aren't fast when you do them right. Company registration, opening a corporate account, a service provision contract structure, a documented portfolio with real and verifiable results. each step done calmly, because rushing a foundation is a mistake you pay dearly for later. On a Wednesday afternoon, I received an email. It was from an HR consultant representing a national fashion retail company, one of the brands that any Brazilian recognizes if they enter a shopping center in any capital of the country. They'd found Moda Cavalcante's seller profile on the platforms, researched who was behind the digital operation. Reached me somehow. They wanted to talk about a possible consulting gig to restructure their online channel. I read the email 3 times, not because I didn't understand, but because sometimes life hands you exactly what you built without warning that it was arriving. And you need a moment to accept that it's real. I replied that same day. We scheduled a call for the following week. The call lasted 40 minutes. I presented what I'd done at Moda Cavalcante with numbers, with a timeline, with methodology, without exaggeration, without false modesty. The way a good, fair vendor presents merchandise, shows what it is, states the price, lets the product speak for itself. At the end of the call, they said they were going to analyze it internally and get back to me. They got back in days with a formal proposal. I read the proposal sitting at the kitchen table, which was where I resolved the important things in my life since I'd arrived in Sao Paulo. The amount was 4 times what I received informally from Moda Cavalcante. The scope was challenging in the right way. The kind of challenge you want, not the kind that sinks you. I saved the document in a folder on my computer with a neutral name that nobody would open out of curiosity. I didn't tell her that night, nor the next. I was processing, but it was more than that. I was waiting for the right moment that I'd already drawn in my head with a clarity that surprised me. It was that week that she started talking about her birthday. She wanted to throw a party not too big, she said, just family and close friends. About 40 people in a buffet her mom had recommended in Vila Mariana. I said all right, that I could help organize whatever she needed. She thanked me with a smile that was genuine, one of those moments when the distance retreated a little and the person I'd met on that Coxinha afternoon appeared for a second. That smile squeezed me in a way I didn't expect. It didn't change what I was going to do, but it reminded me that things aren't simple, that people aren't entirely the worst things they do, that the world rarely fits into heroes and villains the way we'd like it to fit. I truly loved her. Let that be on the record. I loved the woman who went down to the corner bar without a clipboard and without a question just to have coffee with me. I loved the woman who listened to my market analysis with real attention and asked the right questions. I loved the woman who wanted to stop hiding the relationship on that night of cod fritters and beer in Belém. What happened was that the environment turned out to be stronger than her. The family, the circle, the weight of a last name in a neighborhood where a last name means position. These things shape people from the inside out, without them realizing it's happening. And when they realize it, they're already shaped. I'm not absolving. I'm explaining, which is different. The following week, I signed the contract with a national retail company. 2 days before the party, I folded the document carefully, put it inside the inner pocket of the suit jacket I was going to wear to the party, and closed the wardrobe. That night, she was excited, talking about the buffet's decoration, about the dress she'd bought, about who was going to sit next to whom. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, listening, and I remember thinking that that was one of the last nights when the normal life we'd built still existed as such, at least on the surface. I slept earlier than usual. I woke up before the alarm like my dad taught me. And when Saturday night arrived, when I entered that hall with mirrors on the wall and napkins folded into lotus flowers, I was already whole. I'd already resolved everything inside. I already knew every word I was going to say. The only thing I didn't know was the exact moment she was going to give me my cue. It didn't take long. She called me from the other side of the hall with a smile on her face and a man in a gray suit next to her. And what came next? You've already started to find out. What you still don't know is what happened after I put the glass down. That comes now. My dad had a habit I never understood when I was a kid. Every end of the month, after closing his stall at the fair, he'd sit at the kitchen table with a black cover notebook, a pen, and the week's receipts. He'd stay there for an hour, sometimes more, adding, writing, checking. My mom would leave his coffee next to him and wouldn't interrupt. We, the kids, learned that that hour was sacred without anyone needing to explain. One day I asked him what he was writing. He opened the notebook and showed me. It was a simple record. How much had come in, how much had gone out, how much was left, how much he had set aside. And at the end of each page, there was a column he called reserve, a fixed amount he withdrew before any other expense, before paying suppliers, before restocking, before anything. I asked what the reserve was for. He said, for when you need to leave a place without asking anyone for permission. I was 12 years old. I didn't fully understand at the time, but it stuck. When I started making real money inside Multigenerational, the first habit I set up was the reserve. A separate account, a different bank, an automatic transfer every month as soon as the amount came in. It wasn't much at first. It grew along with the company's digital revenue. In 2 years, I'd accumulated enough to go a whole year without needing income from anyone. That account was the only thing I had that was completely invisible to anyone in her family. In the 3 weeks leading up to the party, I used that time to close everything that needed to be closed. The company was registered, the corporate account was active, the contract with the national retail was signed. But that was the outside, the inside. What I needed to hand over at the moment of my exit still needed organization. I put together a document that took 8 days to get ready. It wasn't a performance report, it was more than that. It was the complete history of Multigenerational's digital operation, from the first ad I registered on Mercado Libre to the last seasonal campaign that had run. Data of each action, amount invested, result generated, platform by platform, every login, every password, every contract signed with carriers, every volume agreement with marketplaces, the methodology I developed for catalog management, the customer service process, which guaranteed the high rating, the pricing structure that balanced margin and competitiveness, everything organized in numbered folders, everything with clear instructions on how to operate without me. I didn't do this out of kindness. I did it out of honesty, because what I'd built was real and deserved to keep existing, regardless of what I felt for the family that never saw me. And because I wanted to leave with the conscience that I hadn't torn anything down, I'd only removed what was mine. I copied everything onto a flash drive, a simple blue plastic one you buy at any stationery store. I put it inside a sealed brown envelope with Mr. Cavalcante's name handwritten on the front. I kept it in the drawer on my side of the dresser. On a Thursday of those weeks, 3 days before the party, I called my mom in Qley. She answered on the second ring, as always. My mom is the type who keeps her phone nearby and answers quickly, because she learned that a delayed call is sometimes news that can't wait. She asked how I was. I said I was well, and this time it was true in a way it hadn't been true for a long time. I told her everything on that call about the company I'd built inside Multigenerational, about the recognition that never came, about the message I'd read on her phone, about the signed contract, about the flash drive in the envelope, about what I planned to do at the party. My mom was silent for a while after I finished. Then she said something that only a Northeastern mother says with that direct naturalness that cuts through any rambling. She said, "Are you sure it's not resentment speaking louder than judgment?" I stayed quiet for a moment. Then I said I was sure I had separated the two things for months, precisely so I wouldn't confuse them. That the resentment existed, it was no use lying, but that the decision didn't come from it. It came from an equation that didn't add up anymore and wasn't going to add up. Because some things, when they show what they really are, don't go back just because you want them to. She stayed quiet a bit longer, then said, "All right then, take care of yourself." That phrase of hers, "All right then, take care of yourself," it carried more than it seemed. It was her blessing that she never gave with ceremony, because it wasn't her way. It was the equivalent of my dad opening his black cover notebook and showing the reserve column. It didn't need more explanation. I hung up and spent some time on the apartment balcony looking at the city. Sao Paulo at night has its own luminosity that isn't beautiful in the conventional way, but it has a strength you feel physically. It's the kind of thing you only notice when you're about to change something important, when your internal state is different from usual. And then the external world also seems different. I thought about everything I'd done since I arrived in that city at 22 with a canvas backpack. I thought about the boarding room in Perry with a window to the hallway. I thought about the smell of synthetic fabric on Orient Street in my first week. I thought about the plastic folder with 12 pages of spreadsheets that Mr. Cavalcante had pushed back to me on that Tuesday afternoon. I thought about the late nights at the kitchen table with the laptop open and the coffee getting cold next to me. I thought about the first order from Ribeiro Preto, the size and blouse that made me stare at the phone notification longer than the sale amount justified. I thought about her, about the coffee with milk and coccinia, about the 40 minutes that went by too fast. I didn't regret any of it, neither the mistakes, nor the sleepless nights, nor the time I invested in something that didn't give me the credit I deserved, because all of that brought me to where I was, on that balcony with a company registered in my name, a signed contract in my pocket, and absolute clarity about what was ahead. A good fair vendor doesn't cry over merchandise they sold poorly. They learn what they sold wrong and adjust at the next fair. On Saturday morning, the day of the party, I woke up before the alarm. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, sat at the table where I'd spent so many late nights working. The table was clean, there was no laptop, no notebook, no nothing. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing pending on that table. I drank my coffee slowly. She woke up later, already with her mind on the party, a list of things to do, hairdresser appointment, coordinating who was arriving with whom. I helped with what she asked, answered the questions, confirmed the times, functional and present, as I've always been. At some point in the early afternoon, while she was in the shower, I opened the dresser drawer and took out the brown envelope. I also grabbed the suit jacket I was going to wear that night, ran my hand over the fabric to smooth it out, and put the envelope in the inner pocket. There was a slight bulge on the left side of the chest, barely noticeable, but I felt it. Then I went to the other drawer and took out the signed contract with a national retail. I folded it carefully into 3 equal parts and put it in the right pocket. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror for a moment. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie the way I liked it, no affectation. My hair combed, my face shaved. The same person who had arrived in Bohem Retiro as a stock assistant, without any contacts in this city, now standing in an apartment in Tatuape with 2 documents in my pockets, which represented everything that journey had cost and everything it had generated. There was no pride in the arrogant sense. There was certainty, which is a different and more solid thing. She came out of the bathroom, saw me in my suit jacket, and smiled. Did I look handsome? She said. I said, "Thank you." And it was genuine because she looked beautiful too. Her dress was dark blue. Her hair was different from her daily routine. And in that second, she was once again the woman I'd loved without reservation. But 2 documents in my pockets were still there, and I still knew what was going to happen before that night ended. We arrived at the buffet at 8:15. The parking lot was filling up. The tables already had people. The lighting was the way I'd imagined. That event lighting that makes everything slightly unreal, slightly like a storefront window. I greeted who I was supposed to greet. I accepted a glass of sparkling wine from a waiter's tray. I made conversation where I was expected to make conversation. Inside, I was completely quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you have nothing left to decide. When all variables have already been considered, all possibilities have already been weighed. And all that's left is simply letting the moment arrive. I went to the cold cuts table and stood leaning with my glass in hand. And that was exactly when she called me from the other side of the hall. "Babe, come here. I want to introduce you to Rodrigo." I crossed the hall. What happened next you already know. What you don't know yet is every word I said when I raised my glass. That comes now. There's a version of this scene that I imagined several times before it happened. In this imagined version, I was nervous. My voice came out differently than I wanted. The words arrived out of order. Something in my body betrayed what I'd planned to keep under control. It's what happens when you rehearse a difficult situation in your head for weeks. The fear that in the real moment your body won't keep up with what your mind prepared. That's not what happened. When she finished her sentence and the laughter began to spread across the hall, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. I felt relief. Not the kind that comes when a danger passes, the kind that comes when a doubt you carried without noticing finally gets an answer. As if some part of me was still hoping to be wrong about what I'd understood throughout that whole year, and that phrase said with a smile in a Villa Mariana buffet hall had arrived to confirm that I wasn't. I didn't blink, I didn't tremble. I looked at her for a second, then at Rodrigo, who was still holding a smile, not really knowing what to do with it, then at the glass in my hand. I smiled, and in that smile was everything I wasn't going to say yet. Rodrigo tried to soften it with some random phrase about marriage being like that. Mr. Cavalcante in the back gave a short laugh of support. My mother-in-law was still with her hand over her mouth, pretending it was too much. The background music remained low. The waiters kept circulating with trays. The sparkling wine stayed cold in the flutes. And I kept standing, quiet, smiling, letting the moment breathe. Then, I raised my glass slightly to call attention and spoke with a voice that came out calmer than even I expected. Since everyone is here, I want to make a toast. Clear in my throat. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't classify at the time. It wasn't worry yet, it was more surprise. The kind that comes when someone acts differently from the script you'd projected for them. Mr. Cavalcante, on the other side of the hall, raised his glass with the gesture of someone ready for a common birthday toast. My mother-in-law adjusted her necklace. Some side conversations quieted down. People turned around. I waited until the hall was quiet enough. Not everyone looking, but the ones who mattered. Yes, I want to thank you for being here today. It's an important night. Short pause, especially for me. Mr. Cavalcante frowned slightly, but kept his occasion smile. Rodrigo was still on the side, glass in hand, waiting. I continued. My wife introduced me here as someone with no degree, no future, who lives off her family's company. Immediate silence. The kind that falls all at once, like when someone drops something made of glass, and the noise stops everything for a second. She wasn't being malicious. She was being honest about what she thinks. And I respect honesty even when it hurts. So I'll be honest too. I turned slightly towards Mr. Cavalcante. Mr. Cavalcante, do you remember Tuesday, 2 years and 8 months ago, when I walked into your office with a plastic folder and 12 pages of spreadsheets? He didn't answer. His smile had vanished. You closed the folder, handed it back to me, and said you were glad I had free time to play with Excel. Someone near the window made a low noise. You couldn't tell if it was discomfort or surprise. In that folder was the complete diagnosis of Moda Cavalcante, a 42% drop in-person wholesale volume over 3 years. Fixed costs stable while revenue fell, inventory accumulating, margins being eroded. I spoke the numbers with the naturalness of someone who carries them by heart, because I live them, not because I memorize them. And there was also the solution: digital channel, marketplaces, WhatsApp business, integrated logistics to serve a buyer in any state without depending on in-person flow. Rodrigo had lowered his glass. He was listening to me with a different attention now. The attention of someone who is an investor and recognizes when someone is talking about real results. You didn't want it. That's fine. I did it anyway. I let that settle for 2 seconds. First ad registered on Mercado Libre. 2 years and 7 months ago, 30 pieces. Done on a Saturday morning before any employee arrived, with a borrowed office lamp and a phone in portrait mode. First order. For days later, Ribeiro Preto, a size and blouse. Digital revenue in the first month, enough to pay the company's fixed cost for a week. Digital revenue in the 6th month, greater than the in-person wholesale of the same period. Today, the digital channel represents 73% of Moda Cavalcante's total revenue. The company has a Mercado Libre medal with a 4.8 rating and over 900 reviews from buyers in 22 different states. Customers from Para, from Amazonas, from Aranjo, from Piauí, from Rio Grande do Norte, people who'd never stepped foot in Bom Retiro, and buy every week. I put my hand in my suit's left pocket, took out the brown envelope. The hall was in absolute silence now. Not even the background music seemed to exist anymore. Inside this envelope, there's a flash drive. Everything is on it. Every login, every password, every contract with a carrier, every volume agreement with a platform, the complete catalog, the campaigns, the pricing methodology, the customer service process that guarantees the high reputation. Clear instructions on how to operate every part without me. I extended the envelope towards Mr. Cavalcante. He looked at the envelope for a moment, then reached out and took it without saying anything. His hand was steady, but his face had lost its color. I turned to her. She was standing with her glass halfway between the table and her mouth, her gaze fixed on me, and for the first time that night, her smile had disappeared completely. What was on her face now I recognized. It was the expression of someone processing information that rearranges what they thought they knew. I looked at her for a while, not with anger, not with calculated coldness, with the honesty of someone looking at someone they truly loved and whom the paths separated in a way no toast can fix. You weren't wrong about one thing. I don't have a degree, I never did, and I didn't need one. I learned what I know, weighing merchandise at the Selenka Fair in Kourou with my dad since I was 8. And then I learned the rest by doing, making mistakes, correcting, trying again. It's the only kind of school that ever worked for me. Pause. But you were wrong about the rest. I put my hand in my right pocket, took out the contract folded in 3 parts. I didn't open it. I didn't show it. I just held it. I signed this 2 days ago. It's a consulting contract with a company that anyone in this room would recognize by name if I said it. I won't say it, no. Not because I'm ashamed, but because it's not relevant to what I came here to say today. What is relevant is this. Starting tonight, I'm no longer responsible for anything inside Moda Cavalcante. Operationally, financially, strategically, the flash drive has everything needed to continue. What comes next is no longer my business. Rodrigo made a slight movement, as if he was going to speak. He didn't speak. My brother-in-law, who had been one of the ones who'd laughed the most, was looking at the floor. My mother-in-law had her hand in her lap, no longer on her mouth. I raised my glass one last time. I made a toast at the beginning, saying this was an important night. It is, but not for the reason everyone here thought. I looked at the glass for a second, then at her. This is the last time I drink as your daughter's husband and as the invisible man who built the digital side of a company that never wanted to know my name. She or she drank. The sparkling wine was less cold than when I'd arrived. It didn't matter. I put the glass down on the nearest table, carefully, without noise, without a dramatic gesture, the way you put down anything when you're done using it and won't need it anymore. I grabbed my suit jacket that I'd leaned on a chair near the cold cuts table when I arrived. I put on slowly, adjusted my shirt collar, and walked toward the exit. 40 people. I didn't hear a voice, just my own step on the buffet floor and the muted sound of traffic outside in Villa Mariana, which didn't stop for anything, which remained indifferent and constant as Sao Paulo always was. At the door, I didn't look back, not because I was angry, not because I was afraid of what I'd see if I looked, but because some exits lose their meaning when you hesitate at the door. And I had spent 2 whole years preparing for this one, and it had gone exactly the way I prepared it. And there was nothing in that hall I needed to see one last time. Outside, the night was open. I called a ride app, sat on the curb while I waited, not in a dramatic way, in a tired way, in the kind of exhaustion that comes when you've carried something heavy for a long time. And finally put it down. The car arrived in 6 minutes. While I waited, I received a message. It was her. 2 words. I won't repeat them here, because that's hers and what I felt reading it belongs to no one else. I put the phone in my pocket, got in the car, and gave the address of the flat I'd already rented in BOM Retiro since the previous week. The driver didn't say anything during the ride, and I thanked him internally for that. I looked out the window as Sao Paulo passed by. The streets, the lights, the poles, the movement that never stops. The city I'd arrived in without knowing anyone, that had ignored me in the first months with the typical indifference of a big place, and that later had given me exactly what I came looking for. Not as a gift, but the way Sao Paulo gives things to those who persist, which is putting the raw material in your path and letting you figure out alone what to do with it. I got to the flat, went up, opened the window. BOM Retiro was down below, quiet in the late night, the empty streets, the closed warehouses, Jose Paulino Street without the movement it would have a few hours from then. I kept looking for a time I didn't clock, and then for the first time in a long time, I had nothing to do. No spreadsheet to open, no customer message to answer, no ad to adjust, no pending report, just the city below and the open night. I went to sleep without setting an alarm and slept in a way I hadn't slept for years. Nobody tells you what happens the next morning. Movies end on the heroic exit. The music rises, the credits roll, the character walks through the door, and the world freezes in that turning point moment, as if the aftermath didn't exist or was too simple to deserve screen time. But the aftermath exists, and the aftermath is where real life truly begins, without a script, without a soundtrack, without anyone clapping. I woke up in the Bomb Retiro flat, not knowing what time it was. The window was open the way I'd left it the night before, and the light coming in was advanced morning, 10, 11 o'clock. I couldn't specify without looking at my phone. I didn't look immediately. I lay there for a while, listening to the neighborhood wake up down below. The sound of a warehouse gate opening, a cargo cart on the pavement, someone shouting an order out loud across the street. BOM Retiro in the morning is a specific orchestra that you learn to recognize if you've spent enough time there. And I'd spent enough time. I got up, made coffee with what I bought before the party to stock the flat. I sat on the only chair in the room with a warm cup in my hands and stayed like that for a while, without opening anything, without checking anything. When I finally picked up my phone, it was 11:23, 47 messages. I didn't open any yet. I scrolled through the names to get a lay of the land. Her, my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, which surprised me. Two of her friends I barely knew, Mr. Cavalcante, which surprised me more. Arivaldo, the guy from Aranjo from the Perry boarding house, who had recommended me to Moda Cavalcante years ago and who somehow was still on my contact list. My mom, 2 messages sent early in the morning. I opened my mom's first. The first said, "Did you sleep well?" The second sent 40 minutes later. "You can call me when you can." I called immediately. She answered on the second ring, as always. She asked how I was. I told the truth. I said I was well, that I'd slept in a way I couldn't remember when I'd slept like that last. She was quiet for a second, and then said something I'll keep for the rest of my life. She said my dad would have liked to hear what I'd done. Not the party scene itself. He was a simple man and didn't care much for scenes, but he would have liked to know that his son walked out standing tall without lowering his head, without apologizing for existing. My dad had died 4 years earlier, when I was still in the first months of marriage. We hadn't seen each other much in the final period because of the distance and the routine that swallows intentions when we let it. That's when the bills time doesn't refund, and you learn to carry it without letting it weigh more than it needs to. I talked to my mom for half an hour. She didn't ask questions about what was ahead. She didn't give advice I didn't ask for. She didn't try to fill the space with words. She just stayed on the line the way she always stayed when I needed her. Present without invading. After I hung up, I went to the window with coffee in hand. I kept thinking about what would come next from a practical point of view, which was the only point of view that served me in that moment. The new company was registered. The contract with the national retail was signed and scheduled to start in 2 weeks. The reserve in the separate account guaranteed peace of mind for as long as necessary. The flat was rented for 3 months with the possibility of renewal. Everything I needed existed, not in the easy sense, in the real sense, in the sense that I'd built it with my own hands over 2 years of late nights in silence, and that no laugh in a rented hall undoes what was built with that kind of consistency. The separation process was handled by lawyers on both sides and went without a war. There was nothing to fight over. We had no children. The Tatuape apartment was rented. Our assets were separate because we'd never formalized joint ownership. What was concrete between us was more emotional than material, and paper doesn't divide that. Time is what dissolves it in layers. The same way it settled in, without a set date and without warning. She sent me a message weeks later. I won't transcribe it. I've already said that before, but I'll say it was honest, the kind of person writes when they drop the version they wanted to be and write from the place they truly are. I replied with the same honesty. There was nothing more after that. About Moda Cavalcante, what happened was predictable for anyone who understood what had been built and how. In the first month after my departure, organic traffic on the marketplaces fell 40%. Not because the flash drive was incomplete, it was complete. I made sure of that. But because operating a digital channel isn't following instructions, it's making decisions in real time. It's adjusting a campaign that stopped converting. It's answering a negative review the right way before it affects reputation. It's understanding why a product sold well 1 week and stopped the next, and changing something before the platform's algorithm penalizes the profile. You don't transfer that on a flash drive. You learn that by doing, making mistakes, correcting, the same way I learned everything I learned in life. Mr. Cavalcante called twice. I didn't answer. It wasn't cruelty, it was boundaries. There's a difference between being generous with what you know and being forced to keep building a house on land that was never yours. I'd handed over everything that was possible to hand over. What came next was the responsibility of those who had chosen not to see me while I was inside. Rodrigo, the gray-suited investor, who was next to her at the time of the phrase, sent me a message on LinkedIn 2 months after the party. Direct, professional, without mentioning what had happened that night. He wanted to know if I was open to talking about a project in the fashion sector. I replied that I was, and we scheduled a call. It was a good conversation. He was smarter than his suit suggested and had seen enough in that hall to know I was the kind of person he wanted on his side of a negotiating table. We didn't close anything at that moment, but the door remained open. Sometimes that's enough. The consulting with the national retail started on the scheduled date and was exactly the kind of work that makes you remember why you chose what you chose. Challenging in the right way, with a team that listened, with results that showed in the numbers, and the numbers were attributed to whoever had achieved them. Simple as that. Simple as it had never been at Moda Cavalcante. In 4 months, their digital channel had grown 38%. In 8 months, they asked me to expand the contract scope. I hired 2 assistants. Not stock employees, real professionals, paid fairly, with clear roles and credit for what they produced. Because I knew the cost of not doing that. I knew what happens to a good person when you don't name what they do and don't give credit for what they build. I'd lived on the wrong side of that for long enough to never want to be the other side. I went back to Kuru 4 months after the party. It wasn't an end-of-year visit. It was a normal Thursday in October. I went because I wanted to, because I felt it was time, and I didn't need more reason than that. My mom made country chicken with pareo, which is the dish she makes when she wants to say she's happy without using those words. We sat on the porch of her house after lunch, which is the same porch from when I was a kid, with the same brown ceramic floor and the same view of the unpaved dead-end street. She asked me if I was happy. I spent some time thinking before answering, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to answer precisely. I said I was whole, that happy and whole aren't always the same thing, but that in that moment they were. She nodded her way, which is a short nod, meaning she understands and agrees and doesn't need anything else besides that. I went to the fair the next day, the Friday, Salanka, just like every Friday since before I was born. The movement had changed over the years. The stalls had modernized in some aspects. There were more cell phones, more QR codes, more digital catalogs. Even there, in the Pernambuco outback. But the core was the same. People who wake up before the sun to set up what they have to sell. People who calculate margins in their heads before opening their mouths. People who read the customer by the way they look at the merchandise before getting close. I walked for a while, without rushing among the stalls. At some point, I stopped at a women's clothing stall, a 60-year-old owner, pieces carefully folded on a table covered with blue plastic. She had her phone resting on a makeshift cardboard stand, showing her stall's Instagram profile. She followed 200 people and had 380 followers. She posted product photos with simple captions and clear prices. I kept looking for a second. She noticed and asked if I wanted anything. I said no, I was just admiring. She said, "Thank you," with the naturalness of someone who receives a compliment and goes back to work. I kept walking and thought about how that 60-year-old woman, with 380 followers and a cardboard stand, understood things that large companies with expensive consulting sometimes don't understand. That good merchandise doesn't need complicated presentation. That a customer buys from whoever transmits trust. And trust isn't manufactured. It's built with consistency over time. I returned to Sao Paulo on Monday morning. Laptop open on the desk of the office I'd rented in a downtown co-working space. Coffee next to me. The day's schedule on the screen. I did the same thing my dad did every end of the month. I opened the notebook, picked up the pen, wrote how much had come in, how much had gone out, how much was left. In the last column, the one he called reserve, I wrote the amount, and below it, I wrote what he always wrote below his reserve amount. For when you need to leave a place without asking anyone for permission. I closed the notebook and went to work.